Here's the story with the character names changed to a European style, formatted with natural breaks for easier reading. The content remains unchanged, with no additions or edits, just segmented into paragraphs for clarity. The 911 call came at 2:47 a.m. highway accident. Multiple injuries. Paramedics Frederick and Clara expected a routine transport, but when they arrived at the scene, what the quiet ambulance driver did left them frozen in shock. He pulled out equipment they'd never seen before and started performing impossible procedures. "Sir, you can't do this," Clara shouted. But Edward Hawthorne looked at her with eyes that had seen much worse. "Watch me," he said quietly, because what happened next would reveal a secret he kept hidden for 15 years. Welcome to Hidden Legends. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Edward Hawthorne was the perfect ambulance driver. At 42, he'd worked for Metro Emergency Medical Services for 3 years. He showed up on time for every shift, never late, never complained. He kept his ambulance spotless, knew the routes perfectly, stayed calm in traffic. The paramedics loved Edward. Reliable, quiet, never interfered with their work. Frederick Beaumont and Claire Fitzgerald enjoyed working with him. Frederick was 29, had been a paramedic for 5 years. Clara was 31, had worked in emergency medicine for 7 years. Edward was different from other drivers, very quiet, barely spoke. He only provided necessary information. Hospital ready, traffic heavy, ETA 12 minutes, short, precise sentences. When they asked Edward, "Where are you from?" he'd say, "Different places." When they asked, "Do you have family?" he'd say, "Not anymore." When they asked, "What did you do before this?" he'd say various things. Frederick and Clara were used to Edward's silence, but sometimes they noticed strange things. Edward knew medical terminology very well. Sometimes he'd correct Clara's medication dosages. Sometimes he'd review Frederick's procedures. "Edward, do you have medical training?" they'd asked. "A little," Edward had said, vague as always. Edward Hawthorne's real story was very different. He joined the Army at 18, started in the medical corps, but after basic medicine, he was selected for advanced training, Army Combat Medic, the most elite program. His first deployment was Afghanistan, 2001, when he was 20. He worked in MASH units saving wounded soldiers. He performed surgery under rocket attacks, saved lives during bombings. His second deployment was Iraq, this time more dangerous. Medical support for special operations units, gunshot wounds, explosive injuries, complex trauma cases. Edward's hands had been perfected in war zones. His third deployment was back to Afghanistan, 2006, at 25. Now he was a field surgeon. Advanced medical procedures, emergency operations, saving lives under impossible conditions. But that day was different. The 15th of March, 2007, a mission in Helmand province. Intelligence was wrong. They'd been ambushed. An IED exploded. The Humvee caught fire. 3 soldiers were trapped inside. Edward didn't hesitate. He went into the burning vehicle. He pulled out the first soldier. He pulled out the second soldier. When he went back for the third, a second explosion occurred. That third soldier was Lucas Duval, 24 years old, newly married. Edward saved him too, but shrapnel pieces had lodged in Edward's left arm. He had limited mobility, but his hands remained steady. Lucas survived. Edward's arm was never the same again. "I got injured saving you," Edward would tell himself, "and I'd do it again." He left military service in 2008. At 27, honorable discharge. He wanted to become a civilian doctor. He completed medical school through an accelerated program, became a trauma surgeon, but the real story was just beginning. Everything changed in 2015. Edward was now a successful trauma surgeon. He was married to a beautiful woman named Beatrice. They had a 5-year-old daughter named Charlotte. But that night, Edward was on call at the hospital. While Beatrice and Charlotte waited for him at home, a drunk driver took their lives. Edward couldn't save his family. He had saved hundreds of soldiers in war, but he couldn't save the people he loved most. The trauma affected him deeply. PTSD, depression, alcohol problems. His hands started shaking. He couldn't perform surgery anymore. He lost his medical license. He was fired from the hospital. I didn't lose anyone in war, he'd tell himself. But at home, I lost everything. For 6 years, he worked various jobs trying to get himself together. In 2021, he found work as an ambulance driver. He wanted to stay in the medical field, but not as a doctor. But some things never changed. Edward was still a perfect war doctor. His hands still had surgical precision. His brain could still analyze medical emergencies. Nobody just knew. That Friday night was like any other. Edward, Frederick, and Clara were working the night shift. They'd had a few routine calls, elderly fall, chest pain, minor accident, normal night shift work. At 2:30, they were taking a coffee break. Edward sat quietly as always. Frederick and Clara were discussing next week's plans. Edward, don't you ever take vacations? Clara asked. I don't need vacations, Edward said. Everyone needs them. What do you do in your free time? Edward hesitated. At home, he looked at photos of Beatrice and Charlotte. He talked to them. He remembered the past, but he couldn't say that. I read, he said simply. What do you read? Various things. Frederick laughed. Edward, you're a real mystery. If Frederick knew the truth, he'd understand how right he was. At 2:47, the call came. The dispatcher's voice was cold and clear. Unit 23, I-95 highway, mile 47. Multi-vehicle accident, 5 cars, multiple injuries, entrapment, code red. Edward immediately went on alert. This was the reflex not just of an ambulance driver, but of someone who'd performed trauma surgery for years. Frederick and Clara checked their equipment. Edward started the ambulance. Sirens on, emergency lights flashing, cutting through traffic. This looks big, Frederick said nervously. We're ready, Clara replied. Edward said nothing, but he knew this was very big. When they arrived at I-95, the scene they encountered was horrific. 5 vehicles had collided, a chain reaction accident. An SUV was overturned, engine block completely crushed. The sedan in the middle was unrecognizable. The third vehicle, a pickup truck, had hit the barrier and was lying on its side. Fire crews were using cutting tools to free trapped passengers. Police were directing traffic. Ambulance sirens, radio chatter, the sound of cutting tools, everywhere was chaos. Frederick and Clara froze for a moment at the magnitude of the scene. This could be the biggest accident they'd ever experienced. But Edward? Edward was already moving. Frederick, Clara, there was no hesitation in his voice. Let's triage. We'll start with the most critical case. Suddenly, the quiet ambulance driver was gone. In his place was someone commanding, decisive, whose every movement was certain. They ran to the first patient, a middle-aged woman, extracted from the SUV, unconscious, blood flowing from her chest. Frederick immediately began basic assessment, pulse weak but present, breathing shallow, penetrating chest wound. Stop. Edward's voice was authoritative and sharp. Frederick was shocked. Edward had never spoken like this. What's wrong, Edward? Edward knelt beside the patient. His hands scanned the patient like an X-ray machine. He performed palpation of the chest wall, listened to breath sounds, examined the injury site. This isn't a simple chest wound. Look, signs of hemothorax, tracheal deviation, jugular vein distension. This is cardiac tamponade. Frederick stared with his mouth open. These terms, this assessment, this wasn't basic paramedic work. Edward, how do you, Frederick? This isn't time to talk. Edward's voice came from the mass unit. This woman has blood accumulating around her heart. The heart is compressed. Can't pump. We have 10 minutes or she dies. Edward pulled equipment from the ambulance. Normal ambulances didn't carry such equipment. But Edward's ambulance was different. What are you doing? Clara asked in panic. I'm performing pericardiocentesis, Edward said, putting on gloves. Edward, that's a surgical procedure. We're paramedics, not surgeons. Edward looked at the patient. The woman's lips were turning blue. Her consciousness was fading. I'm a war surgeon, Edward said quietly. Those words hung in the air. Frederick and Clara couldn't believe it. What did you say? But Edward wasn't explaining. He pulled a long, thin needle from his bag, prepared the patient's chest. Clara, prepare manual ventilation. Frederick, vital signs monitor. Edward, If you make a mistake, I won't make a mistake. Edward's voice was determined. I did this in Afghanistan under rocket attack. The needle advanced from the chest wall toward the heart. Suddenly, dark red blood began flowing from the needle. Tamponade being drained, Edward said calmly. The woman's blood pressure began to rise. Her color improved. She could breathe. Incredible, Clara whispered. Not a miracle, Edward replied. War training. After stabilizing the first patient, they ran to the second. A young man extracted from the pickup truck. Unconscious. Multiple trauma, Frederick said. This is above our level. Edward assessed the patient. Abdominal trauma, signs of internal bleeding, shock, hypotension. There's internal bleeding, could be splenic rupture. This is an emergency surgical case. We need to transport him to the hospital, Clara said. We don't have time, Edward replied. This man could die during transport. Edward pulled a large bag from the back of the ambulance. Frederick had never seen this bag before. Edward, what's that? Field surgery kit. When he opened the bag, surgical instruments emerged. Scalpel, hemostat, suture materials, local anesthesia. Frederick and Clara were frozen. Edward, are you really a surgeon? I'm a trauma surgeon, Edward replied, putting on gloves. And this man won't die. In the back of the ambulance on the side of the highway, Edward Hawthorne began performing field surgery, local anesthesia, sterile field preparation, exploratory laparotomy. As his hands moved, Frederick and Clara watched, mesmerized. Splenic laceration grade 3, Edward murmured as if he were speaking in an operating room. Splenectomy required. Frederick's mouth fell open. Are you removing his spleen? I'm saving his life, Edward replied. After a 25-minute operation, Edward made the final suture. The patient's vital signs were improving. Done, Edward said, removing his gloves. Around them gathered firefighters, police, other paramedics. Everyone was looking at Edward, the man who performed surgery in the back of an ambulance on the side of a highway. Sir, who are you? Edward's answer would change everything. Dr. Edward Hawthorne, trauma surgeon, retired. That night, 2 lives were saved. 2 people lived because the ordinary ambulance driver was actually a trauma surgeon. Frederick and Clara were still in shock. Edward, why didn't you ever tell us? Because it wasn't necessary, Edward replied. I'm a driver now. No, Frederick shook his head. You're a doctor. I was, Edward said quietly. Not anymore. As the ambulance headed to the hospital, Frederick and Clara looked at Edward with different eyes. Who was this man? Where did he come from? What had he experienced? And Edward finally was ready to tell his story. Metro General Emergency Room. Dr. Leclerc, the attending physician, began reviewing the cases. Who provided initial care? Our paramedic team, Frederick replied. Dr. Leclerc looked at the medical records and froze. This is extraordinary. Pericardiocentesis, advanced trauma surgery, complicated splenectomy. This is surgeon-level care. Edward was quietly cleaning equipment, but Dr. Leclerc's next question would reveal everything. Who provided this level of care? Frederick and Clara looked at Edward, and Edward finally decided to tell the truth. I did, doctor. This is residency-level trauma surgery. Where were you trained? Edward took a deep breath. Johns Hopkins Medical School, trauma surgery specialist, 15 years experience. Silence. And in that moment, everything made sense. You're saying our ambulance driver is a former surgeon, not just a surgeon, trauma surgeon, emergency specialist. Frederick and Clara were realizing, but the real shock hadn't come yet. Dr. Leclerc's next question would put everything in perspective. Where's your license? Edward's face darkened. I don't have one anymore. Why? After a long silence, Edward answered. Personal problems. I lost my family. I lost myself. I'm not a doctor anymore. In the hospital cafeteria, Edward finally told his story. In 2008, I lost my wife Beatrice and daughter Charlotte. Car accident while I was working at the hospital. They were coming home. Drunk driver. Frederick and Clara listened silently. I was a doctor, but I couldn't save my family. I lost my most important patients. The trauma destroyed me. PTSD, depression, alcohol. I couldn't practice medicine anymore. You lost your license. I gave it up voluntarily for patient safety. I couldn't trust myself anymore. Clara's eyes filled with tears. But tonight was different, Edward said. When I saw those patients, I knew I had to save them. I couldn't save Beatrice and Charlotte, but I can save others. Frederick leaned forward. Edward, you're an incredible doctor. What we saw tonight, that's in the past, Edward said. I'm just a driver now. No, said Dr. Leclerc, approaching. He'd heard the conversation. You're still a doctor. Dr. Leclerc presented Edward with an offer. We have a licensed restoration program, special training for trauma surgeons, if you want. Edward hesitated. I don't know. I'm not ready. Look at what you did tonight. You saved 2 lives. This wasn't random. This is who you are. Frederick and Clara were supportive. Edward, you're the best surgeon we've ever seen, Clara said. You can do this, Frederick said. Edward pulled out photos of Beatrice and Charlotte from his wallet. What do you think? He asked the photos. Should I go back? The wind gently moved the photos as if they were answering. 6 months later, Dr. Edward Hawthorne began working in Metro General's trauma surgery department. He'd regained his license, been recertified. Frederick and Clara worked on his team. They created a pipeline from ambulance driver to surgeon. Street medicine teaches differently, Edward would say. Every second matters. Every decision matters. Every patient deserves the best. Edward's story gained national attention. The story of returning from ambulance driver to surgeon. Other doctors were inspired, but Edward's greatest achievement was yet to come. Edward now trains doctors struggling with PTSD. The circle was complete. Your medical skills never disappear, Edward tells them. They just sleep. They wake up at the right moment. The hands that couldn't save Beatrice and Charlotte now train the next generation, teaching precision, instilling confidence, sharing expertise. Frederick and Clara are now Edward's closest colleagues. We learned from a legend, they say proudly. Because that's what hidden legends do. They don't hide their past. They use it to build better futures. In Edward's office hang 2 photos. The family photo of Beatrice and Charlotte. They are Edward's source of strength, the reason for his inspiration. So I ask you, have you ever known someone like Edward? Healthcare providers whose background you didn't know, where you only saw extraordinary competence. Share your experiences in the comments. Because here at Hidden Legends, we know that the greatest healers often serve in the quietest roles. If this story moved you, share it, subscribe, and help these important stories continue. We'll see you in the next legend. And until then, remember, your ambulance driver might be a hidden doctor who could save your life. Service never ends, it just changes form. This version maintains the original story's details and flow while breaking it into readable paragraphs for a more natural reading experience.